Good day. President Emmanuel Macron of France has given what I found a very strange interview to the Financial Times of London. Macron, of course, is the president of France. He is a well-known person who supports globalization, integration within the European Union, and is identified in France and around the world with the neoliberal or liberal economic policies which have been popular in the West for many years. The Financial Times is the newspaper in London which supports these policies and these objectives, and to the same and similar extent that Macron does. So this meeting, I should say it was a virtual meeting between Macron and the Financial Times, was a meeting of kindred spirits, and that may explain why the Financial Times made this interview its main story on Thursday. What exactly happened during this interview, and why am I bringing it up? Well, first of all, I found it a very, very bizarre interview. Macron was talking primarily, it seems, about the pandemic situation. And it was very interesting what the focus of his comments were. It was not about the disastrous state of the pandemic in Europe. Now, I've done various programs on this channel about this. I've spoken about the way in which the European Commission has completely messed up the rollout of the medications. I apologize again for the circuitous language which has been imposed on me, but which I think all of you understand. So we've had problems with the rollout of these medications across Europe. We know that very few people have received them, that Europe is falling further and further behind other countries like the United States and Britain in this area. We know that the European Commission has been much criticized, in my opinion, rightly criticized, for its mess and mix-up of this of the problems in Europe. And of course there have been growing protests across Europe, both about the lockdowns and about the problems with the rollout of the medications. Of course, these two matters are closely related, but people in Europe are very unhappy. There have been protests in the Netherlands. I was reading just the other day in the Financial Times about more protests in Germany, this time of small business people, the famous Mittelstand, who've now been lobbying the federal German government, saying that if lockdowns are continued for very much longer, the Mittelstand, which has been the absolute pillar of the German economy, is going to come under intense and unbearable pressure, and that they won't be able to cope with the situation for very much longer. We see all of this going on across Europe. We've seen a political crisis in Italy. We've seen protests in all sorts of countries, and criticism of the Commission and criticism of governments within the EU itself. Of course, there have been many criticisms also within France of President Macron, who many people are saying was partly the architect for the slow rollout of medications in Europe, because he used his influence, or this is the allegation, he used his influence on the European Commission to slow down adoption of medications produced by other countries such as the United States, Britain, even Russia, because supposedly he wanted the European Union to focus instead on the French medications, which in the event never actually appeared. So that's an allegation that's been made against him, and it's been damaging against him in France. And we know that, in fact, Marine Le Pen has now caught up with him in the opinion polls. I discussed that too. So you might have expected that all of these problems would be the primary topic of Macron's interview with the Financial Times. Well, that was not the case at all. He didn't talk about the situation in France. He didn't talk to any great extent, it seems, about the situation in Europe. He wasn't really interested or engaged with the economic issues. He was focused instead on Africa and the situation of the pandemic there. And we see this in the first paragraph of the Financial Times report of this interview. French President Emmanuel Macron has said Europe and the US should urgently allocate up to 5% of their current medication supplies to developing countries where the campaigns, the medication campaigns against the pandemic have scarcely begun, and China and Russia are offering to fill the gap. And Macron also proceeds to make various criticisms of AstraZeneca especially. This is the Anglo-Swedish company that is producing the British medication, the Oxford medication, and which has come up for much criticism in the European Union, which I have discussed in previous programs. He says or implies that AstraZeneca is profiteering at the expense of developing countries by offering medications at astronomical prices, 2 or 3 times the price paid by the EU. Macron's also, his primary focus was on Africa and on African nations, and he complains that they're being offered, I'm quoting now from the Financial Times, being offered Chinese and Russian medications of uncertain efficacy against new variants of the infection. Well, what to say about this? Firstly, there is no doubt at all that African countries and developing countries need help. But when you think and take a step back, it's clear that this isn't really Macron's concern. His concern is not about conditions in Africa, which is his primary focus, or indeed in developing countries generally. It is in the fact that the Chinese and the Russians are supposedly stealing a march there and are winning over these countries, and as a result are gaining influence in those countries and in Africa specifically. And in fact, Macron actually says this. Now, with the necessary modifications that are imposed on me, I am now quoting his exact words. It's an unprecedented acceleration of global inequality, and it's politically unsustainable too, because it's paving the way for a war of influence over medications. You can see the Chinese strategy and the Russian strategy too. Well, all I can say is that this is a complete non-starter. There is no conceivable way during a pandemic that the European Union is going to start allocating production of medications, even a 5% production of its medications, to curing problems elsewhere. The United States says the same. So, by the way, does Russia. All 3 of these countries say that they will certainly and happily export their medications when they have met and satisfied their own demands and the needs of their own people. And that is unsurprising. That is what you would expect most governments to do. I would add that some countries, Britain certainly, Russia also, the United States too, understanding that they don't have enough medications yet to directly supply medications to various countries and indeed to African countries, have been entering into production agreements with companies in those countries to produce their medications there. The Russians in particular are doing this on a very considerable scale. Russia only has limited production facilities, even though it's doubled the output of its pharmaceutical industries over the last year, but it has only limited production. It cannot satisfy all demand for the Russian medication. It's negotiated deals with countries like India and Brazil for those to produce its medication for it, and it's also entering into negotiations with a variety of other countries, including, I believe, South Africa, in order to have its medication produced by companies under license in those countries. And that seems to me the proper and correct way forward. But consider and take a step back. As I said, it's not really the humanitarian concerns about Africans or people in developing countries that Macron is concerned about. France has considerable political influence in Africa. It has a large francophone community of states that it supports and which look to France and which France sees as its sphere of influence in Africa. And of course, what's happening is that Macron and the French establishment are becoming concerned that with Europe's inability to provide medications and with France's inability to provide medications, that influence may be eroding, and those countries may be looking to China and Russia instead. I have to say, this seems to me, again, a twisted sense of priorities. At this moment in time, Macron should be focusing on the situation in France. I've said that people in France are unhappy with him. There have been protests against him. Marine Le Pen has in fact, caught up with him in the opinion polls. It's because Macron consistently looks beyond France and concerns himself more about these great geopolitical and, if you like, geophilosophical issues, that he is losing support in France itself. People elect their leaders ultimately in order for those leaders to look after them. This ought to be obvious. This is the nature of democratic politics. That doesn't mean that people are not also concerned about what happens in other countries. Of course they are. The idea that people in France or the United States or Britain or Germany even, or indeed Russia, are entirely insular and are only focused on their own narrow concerns, well, that is completely wrong, and that idea should be put completely to one side. But what people do say is that governments ultimately have their primary responsibility towards their own people. Even the Biden administration in the United States is saying that. Even the Boris Johnson government in Britain is saying that. So France and the French government and Emmanuel Macron ought to be saying that too. The fact that Macron doesn't get it shows why ultimately he is not the right person at this time to be the president of France. General Charles de Gaulle, the president of France that Macron looks up to, had excellent relations with the leaders of many developing countries and especially with the leaders of Africa. He would definitely, in a situation, a crisis like this, have prioritized problems in the French homeland. He would have looked at concerns in France first, and then, when he was able, he would have gone and looked to help friends in other countries too. Until France and the European Union sort out their problems, they can't afford to think about problems in Africa, and certainly not when it's all about some geopolitical battle for influence with the Russians and the Chinese. If the European Union does want to help, well, they can then do what the Russians do and try to find agree licensing agreements with local companies. Difficult though that might be, however, given the problems they're having setting up production facilities in Europe itself. In the meantime, Macron should be focusing on those issues in Europe and in France and waiting and working with other countries to sort out those issues. And if the Russians and the Chinese gain some influence in Africa in the meantime, because they are better organized, well, so be it. That's not Macron's, or should not be, Macron's concern at this time. Thank you very much for joining me for this program. I look forward to you joining me in other programs in the future on this channel. Please look us up on our main channel, the Duran. Please also check out my colleague and friend Alex Christophorou's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also look us up on our various other platforms, BitChute, Library, Odyssey, Rumble, and the rest. Support us also through Patreon, Subscribestar, PayPal, and via Bitcoin. And of course, check out our shop, our wonderful products there, our famous magic mugs, our Duran shirts, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, and the rest. And I look forward to you joining me in my next program. And thank you for joining me on this one. Have a good day.